Hailing back all the way from the days of Medarot 5 and guaranteeing his place in most rosters from 7 to 9 and even onwards is MTR00 Asterios, the Minotaur type, with a kit of Shoot Trap, Hammer, Counter Guard, Biped Legs, and the leg ability of Explorer, which grants S rank on road terrain in addition to the leg standard matches. Now those that have played, say, Medarot 7, 8, and 9 will already know pretty solidly what this Minotaur type is capable of with his relatively tanky kit, and honestly, in Medarot S, that is really no exception either. But his kit is still rather scattered all the same, despite this. Shoot Trap, of course, is a setup-based skill, meaning that it'll put a plant on the field that will trigger anytime an enemy uses a shooting-based skill, mostly for passive aggression and mostly as a deterrent from anyone that is using shoot-based skills on the enemy team. Hammer is your conventional melee attack in this case. That is an explosive AoE, meaning it will damage all 4 parts equally, or all intact parts equally, and spread load the damage thereof evenly across them all. And then, of course, Counter Guard is a defense-based skill, meaning that Asterios will plant himself on the center line and intercept any incoming melee attacks and return damage to sender at 1/2 of the originally intended damage dealt when they go to attack him. Now, honestly, with a scattered kit like what Asterios is packing, it is going to be relatively difficult to actually use him feasibly, as a full AoE, a defense skill, and a support-based skill definitely make using him somewhat tricky. But despite this, he is still packing a lot of very solid armor and specs if you do choose to use him for any reason whatsoever. With a head of almost 4,000 HP, a right arm about 3,300, the shield arm at almost 4,000, and legs at over 4,000 HP means that he's definitely tanking a lot of armor in the HP department, pretty much as you would expect of his motif. His mobility, however, is definitely on the much lower end of where you'd want to be when it comes to mobility, meaning his legs will definitely not be the first choice when they're compared to others when it comes to selection on road-based terrain, even with the leg ability of Explorer coming into account. But despite this, with the melee resist of 1166, definitely packing the melee combat counter very solidly. 739 of the shoot resist means he will be susceptible to higher damage, however, from the long-range combatants from afar. And with an evade of 816, not going to be the greatest there is, but definitely will be on the higher end of possibly evading something every once in a while or grazing it, depending on how low the success is on the incoming attack, more or less when it comes to final damage computation. As a pure set score, I honestly do have to rate Asterios a pretty solid 6 out of 10. Not to say that he is bad or has bad stats or has a bad spread, he's just tricky to make use of, given that all 3 of his skills are scattered between setup, melee, and defense, with an emphasis on biped legs naturally, which will make picking a suitable metal for him very difficult. And in addition to this, with his only form of combat being Hammer, if you exclude the passive aggression from Shoot Trap and the very likelihood of him just planting on the line with Counter Guard, he is not going to be a dedicated damage dealer by any means. And just to go into detail on his head and left arm, usually when you plant Shoot Trap on the field, it will deter them from the first 1 or 2 turns. However, given how smart the enemy AI is getting when it comes to PvP, and even EX trials or even standard farming or story mode, usually after they understand the first time there is a trap here, they will end up not using anything that will trigger it altogether. Which means if Asterios is fighting somebody that excels in long range combat, such as say Medarot in this case, after he triggers the trap the first time, Medarot will pick up pretty quickly, don't use shooting attacks, and instead focus on charging Metaforce and releasing Metaforce nukes instead, which absolutely will hurt Asterios more so than taking damage from the standard shooting attacks. Counter Guard, as well as handy as it is also relatively niche when it comes to the defense skills, more or less in the same case that Shoot Trap is, as once it's triggered the first couple times, if Asterios is still planted on the center line, it does mean that the enemies that have melee skills will not use them to save themselves from the extra damage and not trigger it, which ultimately will kind of put Asterios at a disadvantage and kind of glue him to the line until the defense stance runs out. As mixed parts, on the other hand, I have to rate him just a little higher at a 6.5 out of 10. given that even though his skills as a pure set may not be super handy, as mixed parts you can probably make better use of them more efficiently. Shoot, Trap, Hammer, and Counter Guard all have their uses one way or another, but as a pure set is very likely where you will not see them, unfortunately.